Okay, so Katrina has gone over the first two types of growth measures, would be value added, and try to think that value added trumps all. If you have a value added teacher level report, you are category A and it must be used. So it's number one for that reason. So set that into your mind because a lot of people get confused on that. The second option to measure student growth would be the approved vendors. And if you receive that growth report from the vendor, you are category B and you must use it at a minimum of 10%. And then the third option, which is right now where the vast majority of the teachers in the state of Ohio fall, would be into the local measures. And there are three types of local measures that you can use at a district level. And the most common one that we hear about, and probably the most frequently used, will be the SLOs, the student learning objectives. Shared attribution is another option that districts consider. And then the approved vendor assessments for the category A1 for just the upcoming school year, and A2 teachers. We'll go more into, obviously, the SLOs and shared attribution, but the vendor assessments, remember, if I'm an A1 or an A2, I have value added, so I have to be category A, but they can still use an approved vendor assessment. And in that case, as Katrina told you, the results from that vendor assessment, if their district decides to use them along with value added, then they get entered in on the local side, kind of with the SLOs in that location, because I can't be category A and category B. So they have to be entered in as a local measure. So shared attribution, it's a district's choice as to whether or not they want to use shared attribution. And I copied this off of a guidance document. I think it might be the second link or so on the student growth measure page. There is kind of an overview of student growth measures for teachers. And the very last page of that document is a full page graphic that tells you, breaks down value added. Here are your options for value added, the approved vendor, and then local measures. And you'll see shared attribution as an option there with a definition. And districts asked to have some type of measure that they could use to encourage teamwork and collaboration within their district. So we're calling that shared attribution. And most districts, what they're going to use would be from their value added report at the district level or maybe the building level. We recommend keeping it at that larger scale, district or building. So we only have value added for 4 through 8 math and reading. So for the entire district, what you see on the report is it will basically take all of your math teachers for the district and lump them together and say, here's how you did value added wise as a district in math, and the same for as a district, here's how you did in reading. And then it will combine those two into a composite for the math and the reading combination. So you have 3 options at the district level. It does the same thing for you at the building level, for your middle school or maybe the elementary, depending on how your building is set up and where your grade break might occur. But you would get that also for, we'll say, a middle school. That's 5 through 8. It will give you the middle school combination, the composite for math, for all the math teachers in the building, all the reading and the math and reading combined. So as a district, you might decide to also, in the elementary and high school, we don't always have value added because we usually go K through 3 possibly, where I don't have value added. The high school does not yet have value added either until the end of course rollout in the future. So what they can do at those 2 levels to get a shared attribution is to write a building level SLO. And SLOs have to be based on academics and growth, not on attendance and different things like that. So it's still based on academics, the Common Core, or whatever the curriculum that should be applying there. And that building level SLO would serve as shared attribution. So we're all working on this one SLO together in the elementary school. If a district is going to use shared attribution, it's their choice, then they have to decide how much weight they're going to give to it. Remember, when we talk about student growth, we're talking about half of that pie, that light half of the circle, as Katrina said, is 50% of the evaluation. So shared attribution goes in on the local piece. So if I'm category C, 3rd grade teacher will say, don't have an approved vendor assessment, I'm writing SLOs. My district is going to use shared attribution. We have a building level SLO for the elementary, and they've decided to assign 5% of all the teachers as shared attribution. So whatever the final score is for that building level SLO, let's say it's a 3, remember 2, 3, and 4 get combined into meets expected growth, then 5% of my local measures would be that 3 for shared attribution, and the other 45% would be my SLOs. So if a district uses shared attribution, first they have to decide if they're going to use it, then they need to decide which measure they're going to use. Some districts might be taking the district-wide reading composite and applying it to all the teachers, pre-K through 12, because Common Core stresses literacy across the curriculum. We're all supposed to be responsible for teaching reading, so this will ensure that everyone's paying attention to that, so they might be applying it as 10% to all teachers, the district level reading value added. Yes, ma'am?
Can you do shared attribution for the full 50%?
You can, but it's not recommended. Most districts that are considering that for next year, they're just placing that in as an option to allow them more time to write and develop high-quality SLOs and valid, reliable assessments to go along with their SLOs.
And do they have to be directly tied to the reading and math?
They don't have to be tied to reading or math because you could do building level, so you could focus on science or social studies, whatever the district or buildings decide.
You're basing it on is reading and math data?
Just academics.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions on shared attribution? Anything else that you can think that I need to add, Katrina? Okay, so we'll focus on what most teachers that do not have the value added or the approved vendor assessment data are going to be using, which would be the student learning objectives, the SLOs. For a definition, it's a measurable long-term academic, note that important word, academic goal that's informed by available data that a teacher or a team of teachers sets at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the course for all their students or a subgroup of students. So the important words to keep in mind there are that it has to be measurable. It's based on academics, not behavior, other things that teachers do need to focus on, but we're not measuring for growth. We set them at the beginning of the year. If it's a semester course and I started a new semester in January, then I would set mine for that interval of instruction. So it would start in January. So the beginning of the year depends on the intervals of instruction in your building. For students, all students or subgroup, we'll kind of talk about that as we go through the checklist, so I'll revisit that all students or a subgroup here in a few minutes with you. So in trying to determine for those teachers who did not have value added, which is required by the law also required the Ohio Department of Education to create that list of approved vendor assessments that would give you that 1 through 5 growth measure. And then there was all the other teachers, which are right now is about 70% of the teachers that do not have value added data. It would be smaller if we looked at the approved vendors, but those vary district by district and building by building, so it's hard for us to get that exact number. But most of them are going to be using the SLOs. And as Ohio looked at what other states were doing and the options for growth measures that were available, student learning objectives were a very viable option because they had a lot of bonuses to them, a lot of pluses. Most of your teachers, your good teachers, are doing the same things that SLOs require. They're looking at data when their students come to them. They know where the students are. They know where their weaknesses are, where their strengths are. They focus on the content, what they should be teaching. They check the progress, the growth with formative assessments, maybe FIP. Some of you might be FIP schools. No? FAMS, there's formative assessment in the middle school, where you're checking progress to see how the students are doing throughout the school year. The thing that is new for most teachers is establishing growth targets. Are there any special ed teachers in here? Special education teachers should be the experts at growth targets because that's what they do. They assess where their students are, they determine where they need to be at the end of the school year, and then they do checks along the way. So they're much better at setting growth targets than the rest of us. We have to learn how to do that, and it will take you a while, but you will get very good at that once you realize what data is important and how to analyze that data. SLOs can be used in all subject areas. Does not matter what the content is. It could be career tech, can be math class in second grade, can be the English class as a junior, and they're also adaptable. So if the curriculum happens to change, then you can just adapt the content standard section of your SLO and the assessments to go along with it. There seems to be some confusion about who should and shouldn't be writing SLOs. For this school year, there are only a handful of districts that are required to implement the full OTES model with the teacher performance and the student growth. If you are full implementation, which most of you will be next school year, then you are required to have a minimum of 2 SLOs. For this school year, ODE just recommended and continues to recommend that the teachers, regardless of what category they are, even if you're a value-added teacher or an approved vendor teacher, that you at least write 1 SLO so that you go through the process. We actually met yesterday with about 13 districts that were piloting the student growth measures in Ohio, and they said that it was a great opportunity to be able to write these SLOs and to go through the process because the teachers understood what was involved. They've already gone through the training. They're trying to write them. They're making improvements upon their SLOs based on the feedback that they receive from their approval committees, and they're also aware now of the assessments that they need to have So they're doing some assessment literacy training, and they're starting to create their assessments for their SLOs. There's a lot of work involved. And if you wait until next school year when you're likely to be fully implementing, you have a lot of learning and a lot of work to do, and it's immediately high stakes, 50% of your evaluation. So any districts that can begin piloting or practicing writing SLOs and starting to work on their assessments, it's highly advisable that you start that work now so the teachers have more time and they don't feel so rushed, and it's not high stakes this year for most districts. So in subsequent years, when you're full implementation, regardless of your category, even if I'm that category B teacher who has approved vendor data and I have to use that at a minimum of 10%, my district has decided to allow me to use some local measures in the form of SLOs, I still have to have a minimum of 2. Regardless of your category, if you're using SLOs, it's always a minimum of 2. Remember the A1 teacher who is exclusively value added, that they won't, beginning July 2014, be able to use SLOs or shared attribution because their 50%, their entire student growth, will be comprised of their teacher level value added report. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little confused because this is my introduction to SLOs. I'm like a lot of
Understandable.
And I am a science teacher, and I'm teaching.
What grade?
Sometimes I teach 10th, sometimes.
Okay.
10.
High school.
Let's say I'm a 10th grade teacher and I'm teaching a biology class. When it says a minimum of 2, that is talking for the entire year.
Yes.
That's 50% of my evaluation. Is that correct?
Right.
Who is monitoring the use of SLOs? So who will look at my SLOs and tell me that they're appropriate or not?
We're going to go over the approval process in just a minute. We require a minimum of 2, and we recommend no more than 4 for the entire school
So
year.
they're extremely broad goals.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Kind of like if you try to compare them to your value added, the teacher that has that 8th grade math class, they're tested at the end of the year over the entire content from the year. So for us to break the SLO down into a quarter or a semester, it's not a fair comparison. So if your course lasts for a year, then your SLO covers the content for a year and assesses the content for a year. If it's only a semester course, begins and ends, then it focuses on just that semester. Make sense? ODE does not want any teacher to be sitting in their classroom in isolation writing their SLOs. Whenever and wherever possible, you should be collaborating and sitting down with other third grade teachers, if that's what you do. The high school science teacher, you could sit down with other teachers that maybe teach the same content, the same subject as you. If not, sit down at the department level and work on this content and the assessments together. Because
Even in other districts, right?
if you are smaller districts, which many of us are, then the ESCs have been incredibly helpful in pulling those teachers together from across the county and helping them to ensure that maybe their content matches and they work on the assessments together for their SLOs. So they've done a great job in helping out. Yes, ma'am.
You spoke of the end of course exams at secondary.
In the
So,
future.
In the future, so right now, secondary teachers are in theory creating an interim SLO process because when they go to the state end of course exams, is there a plan to create a state beginning of course exam so that the SLO is in there already?
Remember, if you get value added right now, then you have to use that according to House Bill 555, which we've talked about for the A1 and A2. The end of course exams, we're assuming, and as they're creating them, they are trying to create them so that they will have value added. Nothing is definite until it's actually created and out there, and we collect the data and be certain that it is usable for value added. But our plan is that those end of course exams will have value added. So those teachers would become some type of category A, whether they're A1 or A2, depends on their individual schedule. Okay. So the SLO development process sounds like it's pretty easy and actually can be summed up into about 5 steps. But when you look, each one of these steps seems to have multiple steps within it. So the first process would be to gather and review the available data. The teachers need to collect everything that they can about the group of students that they have this fall or in January, if it's a new group of students that they have for a semester course. And in time, as you go through this process, as I've stated, you will get better and better at identifying what are the most reliable sources of data, what yields the most information for you to create the most appropriate growth targets. And we understand that that will take you a while to do that. And if you have not attended one of our student growth measure trainings that we've offered from November through the end of February, then we won't start those again until the fall, maybe in August. But the ESCs, again, worked with us, and they are replicating our training using our materials at our request. So if you haven't attended one and would like to do so, please check with one of the ESCs around you. So once you have all that data in front of you, you need to do a very thorough analysis of it. The second step would be to determine the interval of instruction, which is pretty basic. It's the beginning August 27th maybe through April 15th is the timeline that we look to end. It might be a year-long course that goes until May 27th or June 1, but the Ohio Revised Code requires that the evaluation process be complete by May 1. So that means that all of your observations, all of your walkthroughs, all of your student growth data, everything should be completed by May 1. The law then goes on to state that the teacher should receive a written report by May 10. The law doesn't address the principal sitting down with you or your evaluator sitting down with you and going over your evaluation. It just says that all the steps must be complete by May 1, and the teacher receives the written report by May 10. So your interval of instruction needs to end around April 15th is our recommended timeline, because that would be the date that you would give your post-assessment. And that would give you a couple of weeks to go through, score your assessment, get your data together and into a template that we'll show you at the end, where you determine yes or no whether each student met their target. And then by May 1, you can turn that information over to your evaluator, your principal or HR, whoever that may be. And that gives them 10 more days to get all the data entered into ETPES. It's the Electronic Teacher Principal Evaluation System. And your growth information, your ratings on your observations, that all gets entered into ETPES by May 10 in a typical year of implementation. Yes, ma'am?
So in theory, you're a year in the rear
On value added.
on value added and on SLOs or no?
No, SLOs are this year's student this year's data, and it's all complete by May 1.
And consideration has been taken into the fact that, for example, OAAs, which are the value added assessment, as I understand, and eventually PARC, are going on at the same time as all these other teachers are going to be finalizing their SLOs for the April 15th calculation. So
Yes.
these students are going to be assessed every which way during that time frame in order to meet these.
In our classrooms, we're assessing kids almost every day, whether it's a chapter test or a quiz or a unit exam or a midterm.
In a new system beginning
Yes.
next year. Okay.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
As the OAA transitions to PARC, is there a gap in value added, or is there
No.
some statistical?
The baseline will reset basically when the PARC assessment comes out, because as Katrina told you, the value added goes on a 1, 2, or 3, whatever you have available, rolling average. So that rolling average will reset that year and start over again as year 1 when the PARC assessments roll out. But there will be no gap. There will still be value added data available. Okay?
So, isn't there a year when you don't have anything?
Nope. Remember, when you think about value added, an easy way to think of it is either you maintain your place from year to year or you move up. So if I'm a student, we'll say in a high school, and this year I was number 5,155 on the science test. I know it's not value added, but I'm just using it as an example. Next year the PARC assessment comes out, I take the same test, and I'm still roughly around number 5,155. So they're still applying the same measures to that assessment, and the students should all still roughly maintain their place or move up. Okay? Anything else you can think to add? Okay, so you identify your content, which, as we've said, has to cover the entire year or the entire semester if you're teaching a semester course. You choose, or in most cases, are creating at the district level your assessments. Set your growth targets, and then you submit your SLO at the local level. Someone in your district approves that SLO, we'll go into that. And then at the very end, remember, right around May, you're going to score your SLO, you're going to say your yeses and nos, and your evaluator will help you determine that score. So we'll go through the checklist for an SLO. Online, there's a template for where you write your SLO, and then there is a checklist. This would be the template where you, as the teacher, write the pieces of the SLO, the baseline and trend data, the student population, interval of instruction, and so on. And each one of those sections corresponds to a checklist. This checklist should be beside of you as you're writing your SLO. We teach our students to write to rubrics and to meet each one of the items. As teachers, we need to do the same thing. So you should have this checklist out beside of you. And you can see that the columns, the first one, baseline and trend data, would correspond to the template where you're writing your baseline and trend data. And you want to be sure that you address each one of these in your SLO, because in order for your SLO to be approved at your local level, it must have a check in every one of these boxes. There are a couple that could be marked not applicable, which we'll talk about. So the first section is the baseline and trend data, and these are kind of a summary of the checkboxes on that one-page checklist. Identifies sources of information and summarizes the information. So as a teacher, when you're writing the baseline and trend data, where did you pull your information from? Did you give a pre-assessment, and that's where you have this information? Did you look at how the students scored in the end of course exam that they may have taken the year before, their final grades from the year before? What information did you use? Think about it numerically in narrative. Put a table of some sorts in there where you've summarized this information into some kind of table that makes sense to you, and then explain that table so that the committee or whomever is approving it at your local level understands what this data means to you and how it's going to help guide your entire SLO. You have to draw upon trend data if it's available. If it's not available, simply state no trend data was available. But in almost every case, unless you're a first-year teacher or a brand new teacher to a new course, you should have trend data available. So you know that from year to year when the students come to you that they do poorly in these areas, but they're really strong in these other areas. You might also know once you give your pretest from year to year, the students generally do have a weakness in these 5 standards, and they have strengths in these 10 areas. So you have that trend data available. Even if it's not numbers, you still generally know when they come to you year to year their strengths and weaknesses. Student population seems pretty straightforward and simple, and in some ways it is. You're going to identify how many students are in this SLO, which should be all the students. If you're the Biology 1 teacher, then every student that's in your Biology 1 class, first period, third period, whatever the case may be, they're all covered in this SLO. So how many are they? What grade are they in? There might be some 10th graders in your Biology 1 class. There might be some seniors. Describe the student population and consider any contextual factors that might impact growth. So out of my 150 students that are in my Biology 1 class, 20 of them are special education. 2 of them have a 504. Are they identified in reading that might impact growth? Point out any issues. You know that one student is not identified anyway, but he or she has health issues and he's absent frequently. What might impact her growth? Be clear and upfront so that the committee knows, you know, and your administrator knows. The last checkbox does not exclude any students because all the students that you instruct should be included in your SLO, basically unless they're covered by someone else's SLO. So if students get pulled out of my 2nd grade math class because the intervention specialist teaches math to them and they're covered on her SLO and she gives their grade, then you need to explain that these 5 kids are not included because they're covered under Mrs. Smith's SLO and she administers their grade. If no subgroups are excluded, let the committee know you did not ignore that and state, all of my students are covered, no student was excluded. It's okay.
How do you write about your population?
You're not going to know that in most cases until the fall. That's why we recommend that you turn your SLO in to your committee if it is the recommendation that we ask for, that it be a committee around or no later than the beginning to the middle of October. So that gives you a month and a half in most cases to get to know your students, to collect your data, to give your pre-assessments. So you have time to do that always. Even if it's a semester or a quarter, the district has to have another approval interval. It's going to be much shorter than if it were a year-long course.
The other parts of this now to get ready.
Exactly. So you can get your content ready. You can start working on your assessments. You could fill in pieces for your student population, what you want to be sure that you address, just to remind yourself possibly. The interval of instruction is definitely straightforward. It might be August 22nd to April 15th, like we talked about. If it's a semester, it's January 1, possibly, through April 15. Standards and content, the biggest mistake here is that it's too narrow. It has to be, you must have one course level SLO that covers the content for the entire year, if it's a year-long course, and all your students are on there, unless they're on someone else's SLO. So you need to identify the most important content and standards. A lot of times people focus on the power standards. That will help you. The Common Core is very good at telling you these are the most important skills for kindergartners in math. They'll help you focus too if you read the introduction for those sections. That'll help you identify where are the overarching, the umbrella standards that the students need to know in order to be successful next year in the next course. Then you need to explain why you chose those. Why do you think they were the most important? The last one could possibly be marked not applicable if it's not a targeted SLO. Once you have that broad course level SLO in place, you need a minimum of 2. So for your second one, you could focus in on the low achieving students or the high achieving subgroup. And so I'm only focusing on about 20 of my 150 students possibly. And for this low achieving, I know that these 6 standards are their weakest and they're really important for their future growth. So I'm going to focus on these 6 standards for these 20 students. You can only have that narrow SLO focused on the subgroup once you have that broad course SLO in place. If I teach English 9, 9th grade English, English 1, all day, I need 2 SLOs. You could do the broad course and the targeted SLO, or you could take your content and split it in half in a logical place. English is an easy example, so I chose it for that reason. You could write one SLO that all 150 students are on for reading and literacy, and the other SLO, all 150 students are on this too, and it's grammar and composition. I still teach both of these content areas all year to all my students. So you have 2 options to get those 2 SLOs.
I want to make sure I understand. If I have a handful of students who are identified and are working with an intervention specialist, and she is writing SLOs with those children, then I will not include them in my population in any of my SLOs?
It will depend on how your district has that instructional program set up. So you and your district will need to talk about that. In some cases, those students might be counted on both of your SLOs, which is fine. Because when we link and value added, you might claim 80% of these students, and I, as the intervention specialist, only claim 20%. So we're both claiming them, just at different percentages. We can't do that linkage and percent attribution through the SLO, but we can double count them on different teachers' SLOs. Okay? Choosing assessments. We definitely want you to choose the correct assessment for whatever your content might be. If you're teaching music or art, you don't always want or need a paper and pencil test. You might ask the students to produce something. In art class, you might ask the students to do a performance piece. In music class, so you should choose the assessment that is appropriate for the content and what you need to do. You might have a combination of a performance assessment and a paper and pencil. But note the last point, ODE strongly recommends that districts not allow individual teachers to create assessments for use in their classroom. This is 50% of your evaluation. And we think the most learning comes from that collaboration. If we're all teaching 3rd grade reading, we should all have the same content on our SLO and we should all be using the same assessments. And if you're in that small district where you're the only teacher that does music for the whole building, then you need to work with the other music teachers in the county, somehow work together. If you have to do it alone at your level in your district, you need to include a special education teacher, an assessment person from your building, a curriculum person. Other eyes have to be on that test and see it and go through it with you to be sure that it's valid and reliable. We also have a separate document on the webpage, the student growth measures, to help you go through selecting assessments and to just check the assessments that you might have created. These are just some options that you could use. Like I said, it does not have to be paper and pencil. If you have performance and production, different assessments like that, you need a quality rubric to measure those. It's not just that you watched it and you gave them an A. You need a rubric and you need to point out what you're looking for, what are you evaluating these students on, and you're using that rubric as your evaluation piece. So the assessment checkbox, back to what you should include and whether or not it will be approved, that it has to be valid and reliable, and it's reviewed by content experts. Content experts means that a group of people sat down together and looked at it. The music teacher didn't evaluate the science test. They're in the same content. They know this content. They're familiar with it. If it's valid, then it's going to be certain that it's measuring what it's supposed to measure. If it's a 9th grade social studies test, but it's written at a 12th grade reading level, am I assessing social studies or am I assessing how well my students read? So it measures the content it's supposed to measure. And if it's reliable, if I give it year to year, I'll roughly get the same results. Describe how the assessment has stretch. This is a new term for most. When we talk about stretch, we're talking about, can your lowest achieving student show something on the pre and the post test? So in other words, the teacher needs to state that I have some basic low-level knowledge skill questions, and at the same time I have some advanced level skill and knowledge questions for my high-end students, so that the lowest and the highest can grow from the beginning to the end. If you have multiple assessments like a paper and pencil and a performance test, you need to explain how you're going to combine them into one final post-assessment score that will be entered. Giving an example is the best way to do that. If you've met the first three, you've basically followed the assessment guidelines. Growth targets should be developmentally appropriate and then also rigorous and attainable. People get nervous. We're not talking about proficiency and achievement. We're talking about, are they developmentally appropriate for the students based upon where they started. So if you look at the check boxes, all the students have to have a growth target. No one was left off accidentally. And we say they're developmentally appropriate as determined by their baseline or trend data or pretest. So you have something to decide that this student started at a 15%, so I don't expect him to score a 90 at the end of the year. And then you provide tiered targets whenever possible. You want to tier them into groups because that'll ensure that you look at your high achieving and your low achieving students. If we don't do that, we tend to teach to the average, the typical student, and we forget to challenge the high and to bring those low students up. Examples of growth targets, I'm going to have to skip through. Hopefully we'll be able to get this posted online for you. So that you can see some high quality and low quality. So the rationale piece is the last piece on the SLO, and if you notice it has the most checkboxes, so that should tell you that it's probably the most important piece. It's the one that wraps everything up into a nice little package with a bow on top. If you look, it touches on the content. How well did the teacher know their students? How well did they know their content? Why did you choose that content? It goes back and pretty much reviews everything when you look at the checkboxes. Demonstrates the teacher's knowledge of the standards and the content, explains why the targets are appropriate. So in other words, did you use your baseline data to establish these targets, or did you just arbitrarily assign them, which you should not do? Did you address the students' needs? If you pointed out their weaknesses in the beginning, which you should have, how did you address them through this SLO? Did you use the data? In other words, reference your baseline, your pretest information. And everyone forgets that last one. It needs to align with broader building district goals. SLOs are approved at the local level in your district or in your building. ODE recommends committees do that. It's a local decision, though. As the committee reviews the SLOs, they should provide feedback to the teacher if there are things they aren't clear on or where they need more detail. They need to be specific and let the teacher know so that they can revise it correctly. The SLOs at the end of the year, we said by May 1, remember, are scored as determined by the % of students that met their growth target. So to give you an example, the SLO scoring template, the teacher would plug in all their students and they would establish their baseline score, their pretest score. They list what their growth target is at the beginning of the course. This is completed. And then at the end, once that post-assessment is administered, they say yes or no as to whether each student met their target. And remember, we said it's a 1 through 5 rating, just like value added in the approved vendor. So we don't want a 1 because that's below expected growth. You'd want a 2 or higher. So I need at least 60% of my students to meet or exceed their target so that I get that 2 or higher. Our website, if you go to ODE's homepage and type in Educator Evaluation, it will take you to the evaluation landing page where you'll see student growth measures, district resources. This is the beginning of our student growth measures training that was offered, like I told you, November through February. Please contact one of your ESCs if you would like to go, and we encourage you to go. These are your contact people. The SGM, if you have student growth questions, comes to me at ODE. Evaluation, questions on the performance side, you can send there. And then there are 5 regional people across the state that work with me. Katrina is the Southwest person that you can also send questions to.